Well, good evening, everyone. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the book of Ezekiel tonight. So if you want to go ahead and find your place, we're going to be in Ezekiel chapter 1. And we're going to go ahead and dive right into this. I was debating on how to split this up, being that I'm teaching tonight and preaching on Sunday and also Sunday night. I was going to preach on the book of Ezekiel just on Sunday, but there was a lot that I wanted to cover, so I decided to split it up into 3 different sections. So we're going to look at all of the book of Ezekiel. We're going to look at a third of it tonight, and then we're going to look at the center of it on Sunday morning, and then Sunday evening we're going to go to the latter third of the book of Ezekiel. And the book of Ezekiel he is a major prophet. And when you look at the major prophets, a lot of them are written in a similar way. You'll notice that whenever you see books like Ezekiel, or you look at books like Jeremiah, or even looking at the book of Isaiah, they have a similar structure, meaning that they're written in a similar way. In the beginning, when you notice the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel, they all begin by introducing the prophet, by introducing their call. For example, the Lord goes to Jeremiah and Jeremiah responds, "Lord, I'm just a young man. How can I do this?" The Lord comes to Isaiah and Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe fills the temple, and he looks and says, "I'm a man of unclean lips," but nevertheless he says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." Ezekiel opens up in a similar fashion like Jeremiah and like Isaiah. So it opens up with describing Ezekiel's call. And then in the center of these books, it's quite similar as well. Whether you're looking at whatever major prophet you're looking at, it speaks about Jerusalem or Israel or Judah falling into sin and falling into rebellion and the consequences of that, which would be judgment, and judgment that would be brought upon them by another nation, whether it be Assyria, whether it be Babylon. And so it has that similar structure here in Ezekiel, that captivity is going to come, destruction is going to come to Jerusalem, to the temple, and then it closes in these books like Ezekiel, like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, and the end by describing this restoration that is going to come, and actually describing the end of the age when the Lord is going to make all things right and all things new. And so here's what we're going to see in Ezekiel, but we'll begin tonight by looking at the call of Ezekiel. And if there's ever a prophet who had to go through very difficult circumstances, it was the prophet of Ezekiel. This man was called by God, and he was able to see mighty things that we would long to see. But the book of Ezekiel teaches us that whenever these prophets like Isaiah and like Ezekiel see the glory of the Lord, and you think of Moses who saw the glory of the Lord, or you think of John the Revelator who saw similar images like Ezekiel. When you see the glory of God, when you are able to witness these things, every single person who was called by God and saw things like Ezekiel, like John the Revelator, like Isaiah, had a very difficult life. So with that call came a very high cost. So the call of God is a costly call. And that's what we see in the book of Ezekiel here in the very beginning. So it opens up in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, as it says, "In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, while I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile. The word of the Lord came directly to the priest Ezekiel, son of Bazai, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar Canal. The Lord's hand was on him there." And so I titled tonight's message, "When you find God, or when you see God, the presence of God in unexpected places." Because Ezekiel, he was about to be the priest. He was 30 years old, which means he would be instated as a priest. But instead of being instated as a priest, he is now sitting in captivity in Babylon. And you can imagine the discouragement that he is feeling, knowing that at that moment, in the 30th year of his life, he would have been the priest. He would have had this position in which he would have been able to serve in the temple. And here he is away from the temple, away from the presence of God. And he missed being in the presence of God. He missed being with his people. He missed being there in Jerusalem. So you can imagine this is a man who was reflecting on this time in which he was supposed to finally arrive at this moment where he was to be the priest. But now he is sitting with the captives. He is sitting in Babylon, in the land of the Chaldeans, or in other words, that's another term for Babylon. And here he is in this desolate place in his life, in which he is a captive, in which he is a slave, whenever he was supposed to be going into his priestly ministry. And so he's thinking, I would love to be in the presence of God. I would love to be able to serve in the temple, to be able to be there in the temple serving God, and especially those who were in Jerusalem who served in this priestly manner. They always looked at the presence of God and thought of it in terms of being in Jerusalem. You think about Jonah, for instance. Whenever Jonah tried to get away from the presence of God, he went to Tarshish. He tried to go away from Jerusalem. He tried to go away from the temple, because they equated the temple as being the place where God would dwell. That was the dwelling place of God. And so when Jonah it actually says he fled the presence of the Lord. He's trying to get away from the temple. And here is Ezekiel away from the temple, who was depressed and discouraged because he's not there, but yet God shows up in an unexpected place. God shows up not in the temple in Jerusalem. He doesn't show up in Jerusalem at all. God is about to show up in Ezekiel's life far away from Jerusalem in Babylon. And here, this is why I titled this message, When God Shows Up in Places That You Don't Expect. And there are moments in our lives where God shows up in times that we don't expect Him to, in ways that we don't expect Him to, and in places that we don't expect Him to. You see this even in the life of Joseph. Joseph was there in the pit, and he was in the prison, and you see him in the prison, and in the middle of being in the prison, it's very specific where the writer of Genesis tells us that God was there with Joseph in the prison. That's an unexpected place for God to be there. So God is with us even in places that we don't expect Him to be. And so here he is, and it says in verse 4, he begins to see this vision of God's glory. It says, I looked and there was a whirlwind coming from the north, which reminds us of the book of Job. This speaks about God's presence. It was coming from the north, a huge cloud with fire, once again, reflecting back as Israel wandered through the wilderness, and they were led by the fire of the Lord that would lead them through the wilderness. A huge cloud with fire flashing back and forth and brilliant light all around it. In the center of the fire there was a gleam like amber. The likeness of 4 living creatures came from it, and this was their appearance. So he begins to unfold and begin to describe what he saw as he saw the glory of the Lord, this vision of the glory of God. And he sees these 4 living creatures. These 4 living creatures which all point to aspects of God's nature and of His character. And even whenever you're reading through the Gospels, the 4 different Gospels, when you read about these creatures, each one of the Gospels are actually reflective of each one of these creatures that are mentioned here in the book of Ezekiel. But not to dive too far into that, he begins to speak about this wheel that is within a wheel and is covered with, and you even see that in Isaiah where it has the wings which are covered with the wings, and you have these creatures that are covered with eyes, and you have these wheels that are within a wheel that are turning around, and they see everything. This is God's royal chariot, and God is there. And the presence of God is there. And it's this wheel within a wheel, as it describes God's sight and His vision of all things, that nothing is hidden from God's sight, that He sees it all, that He sees all things, that He notices all things, that there is nothing that is hidden from the sight of God. And then it begins to speak about these living creatures, and Ezekiel begins to describe them in detail. In verse 15 it says, when I looked at the living creatures, there was one wheel on the ground beside each of the 4 faced creatures. The appearance of the wheels and and their craftsmanship was like a gleam of beryl, and all four had the same likeness. Their appearance and craftsmanship was like a wheel within a wheel. And so here it is, it says in verse 18, their rims were tall and awe-inspiring. Each of their four rims were full of eyes all around. So this is telling us here that God sees it all. And that's a comforting thing. It can either be a thing that can frighten you, or it can be a thing that comforts you. Knowing if God is your Father, then God's eyes being upon you is a thing that gives you comfort. Could you imagine thinking and saying, I wonder if God sees what is going on right now? It would be a very discouraging thought to say, I don't know if God sees what's going on. And when you read through the book of Ezekiel, that's one of the main things that the people are saying. They are saying, God does not see what we are doing. They're in rebellion. That's why they're beginning to be taken into captivity to the Babylonians. And so here, the people are saying, God doesn't see, God doesn't notice, but Ezekiel opens up by saying, no, there's a wheel that is within a wheel, and it's covered with eyes, and God sees it all. God sees every injustice. God sees everything that is done under the sun, in the heavens. He sees it all. Nothing is hidden from the sight of our God. And that's what Ezekiel is trying to make so clear, because that's one of the main cases that people are bringing up, is that God does not see. And you can even get discouraged in life and say, I wonder if God sees my suffering. Does He see my affliction? Does He see what I'm going through? Does He care what I'm going through? Does He notice it? Does He see it? Because there's so much going on in the world that you could look and say, why would God pay attention to my small, little, insignificant life when there's so much else that is going on? But Ezekiel reminds us, no, there's a wheel within a wheel that is covered with eyes, and God can see it all. And His providential hand is upon all things. He sees it all. He knows all. And so he begins to go into great detail about these living creatures. And when he sees this at the end of chapter 1, it says in verse 28, the appearance of the brilliant light all around was like that of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. This was the appearance of the likeness of the Lord's glory. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard a voice speaking. So he sees this, and much like Isaiah, and much like John the Revelator, and much like Daniel who saw the glory of God, everybody who sees the glory of God, they do one thing in common. They always fall down. They fall face down. And here he is, and God speaks to him in chapter 2. And it says in verse 1, He said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. And so he asked him to stand up. And he says, and I'm going to speak to you. In verse 2, and it says, and as he spoke to me, the Spirit entered me and set me on my feet. And I listened to the one speaking to me. Isn't that incredible there that God says stand up, and Ezekiel doesn't even have the power to stand up. The Spirit actually has to give him the strength and enable him to stand up. It says, He said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to rebellious pagans who have rebelled against me. The Israelites and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this day. The descendants are obstinate and hard-hearted. I am sending you to them, and you must say to them, this is what the Lord God says. And then in verse 6 it says, But you, son of man, do not be afraid of them, and do not be afraid of their words. Even though briars and thorns are beside you, and you live among scorpions, don't be afraid of their words, or discouraged by the look on their faces, for they are a rebellious house. Now that's interesting right here. God is beginning to call Ezekiel, and the first thing that He says is, do not pay attention to the way that they look. So this just automatically lets Ezekiel know something, that the words that he is going to speak are not going to be popular words. They're not going to be words that everybody is going to long to hear. These are going to be difficult words that God's going to put into the mouth of Ezekiel. And He tells Ezekiel, He says, don't even look at their faces. He says, don't look. He says, I'm going to send you among briars and thorns. What a way to describe people. He looks and he says, you're going to be living beside briars and thorns, meaning they're going to cause you pain. They're going to cause you suffering. And he says, and not only that, he says, you are going to live among scorpions. So these are going to be people who are going to try to harm him. He says, don't be afraid of their words, meaning they are going to speak against him. And so this shows that whenever Ezekiel is about to be called, and he knows right from the start that he is going to have to do something very difficult. You see, we all would love to see these things that Ezekiel saw. Will we not? Wouldn't you love to see? He's trying to describe what he sees. And he even says it's like this. It's not actually that. He's just looking. He's trying to think of words that he can come up with that can communicate what he's seeing. It's not exactly what he saw. He always uses the words likeness. It was like a man. It was the likeness of the glory of God. It was like this, like that. Because that's not literally what he saw, but he was trying to just grasp at these words to describe. That's why even Paul himself said, I can't describe what I saw. There's no human words, even John the Revelator. That's why they use symbolism. Whenever they try to describe God and His glory, there's no human language that we can use to articulate the glory of God. We have to use things that are familiar to us, and then we say, it's like that, so that we can somehow comprehend it in a not fully, but in part. And so here, God is speaking to Ezekiel, and he sees the glory of God, and it's something that we would all long to see, but we would hate to hear the words that God speaks to Ezekiel spoken to us, because he is about to hear some very difficult words. And it says in chapter 3, it says, he said to me, Son of man, in verse 1 of chapter 3, he said to me, Son of man, eat what you find here. Eat this scroll, then go and speak to the house of Israel. So here he is doing much like what John did in the book of Revelation, where he eats the scroll, and he's eating the scroll, which represents the words of God that he is going to speak to the people of Israel. It says in verse 2, so I opened my mouth, and he fed me the scroll. Son of man, he said to me, feed your stomach and fill your belly with this scroll I am giving you. So I ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. And this also teaches us the importance, because these are the words of God going into his mouth that he is going to speak, which are recorded for us. So he's looking at this and saying, these words that seem so harsh and that are full of rebuke and correction, he tastes them, and they taste like honey to his mouth. Even the psalmist says, your words are sweet as honey to my mouth. So we look at the words of God, and even when they seem at their harshest, they are still as sweet as honey. They are still precious to us, and they still strengthen us. And this actually fed Ezekiel. So this shows us that the Word of God feeds us. It nourishes us. We come here tonight so that we could be fed. I had a fantastic meal before I got here. I was able to eat some deer meat, some fresh mustard out the garden, and just having that meal. But here is Ezekiel saying, I've got a meal that is better than that. And this right here, there's nothing better. I mean, you think about Thanksgiving that is coming up, and thinking about the good food that you will partake in. But there is nothing that is greater than this here. This is something that will nourish you, that will strengthen you, that will give you what you need. And so here he is eating the scroll. It's sweet as honey to his mouth. And then God speaks to him once again and says this in verse 8. Look, I have made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads. So in other words, I've made you very hard-headed. He was saying, listen, now, does anybody know anyone who's hard-headed? Can anyone? So here he says, I'm going to make your head hard. I'm going to make your head just as hard as theirs is. So God is making him hard. He's strengthening him. He's giving him the ability that he needs to be able to do the task. So that's what it means that whenever God calls us, He's going to equip us to do what He calls us to do. So He makes him prepared for this. He prepares him for the battle. He prepares him for what is to come. It says in verse 9, I've made your forehead like a diamond, harder than flint. Don't be afraid of them or discouraged by the look on their faces. Notice how he says that over and over again. Don't be discouraged by their faces. That's incredible. He's going to say things that are going to be so offensive to these people that they're going to be like, well, Stephen had to endure this, didn't he? When Stephen was declaring the Word of God, they were gnashing their teeth. and so upset. But here he says, don't look at their faces. In other words, remember the faces that you saw in the vision of the glory of God. When you get discouraged, he says, don't remember their faces. Remember the face of the faces of the creatures, the face of the man that you saw there on the chariot. Remember my face. And then it says in verse 10, it says, next he said to me, Son of man, listen carefully to all my words that I speak to you and take them to heart. Go to your people, the exiles, and speak to them. Tell them this is what the Lord God says, whether they listen or refuse to listen. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard a loud rumbling sound behind me. Bless the glory of the Lord in His place, with the sound of the living creatures' wings brushing against each other, and the sound of the wheels beside them, a loud rumbling sound. The Spirit lifted me up and took me away. I left, and notice this. This is incredible. He is leaving the presence of God, and it says, I left in bitterness and in an angry spirit, and the Lord's hand was on me powerfully. Those are interesting words there. That he's leaving the presence of God and he has this bitterness and he has this spirit of which he's angry. Perhaps it could be anger of the people's rebellion. And you remember that the Lord said that He was going to make his head hard. He was going to make his forehead hard. In other words, he was preparing Ezekiel to go forward and also realizing how difficult of a task this was going to be. He's leaving the presence of God. It's not as if God just said, here's my glory, here's my presence, you have seen me, now go tell others about me. No, He says, I'm going to give you words to speak. And whenever he heard this changed Ezekiel from this day forward. And notice how much of an impact it had upon him. In verse 15 it says, I came to the exiles at Tel Aviv who were living by the Chabar Canal, and I sat there among them stunned for 7 days. You see, when you really see the glory of God, Ezekiel couldn't speak for 7 days. God gives him words to speak, and he sits there stunned, sitting by this canal where he can't even open his mouth to speak because of the glory of God. Because he saw the glory, which is the word kavod. It's this heaviness, this weightiness of God's glory and of God's holiness. And he's sitting there stunned by what he saw. And then we go to chapter 4. Because what is different about Ezekiel is that Ezekiel, he performs these signs. He does things that are very interesting, that are not like other prophets. He uses these signs that God tells him. So yes, he speaks in allegory and in parables, but he also does certain things that are quite strange that God tells him to do. And so you have to realize that this man was going to be in a position in which he was going to be a priest, because it was his 30th year. He was 30 years old, was going to be a priest, and he was going to be in this position in which he would have this respect and honor. But now God is going to put him through situations that are going to literally humiliate him. He's going to make him do things that even Ezekiel says, God, I cannot do that. You can't make me do this. But yet, this is the cost. Like I said, we are fine with wanting to see the glory of God. But with seeing the glory of God comes at a cost for those who, every person in the Bible who saw the glory of God, it came at a high cost. And so here, the cost to Ezekiel is going to be these signs that he has to do that are going to take a lot of sacrifice on his behalf. For example, in chapter 1 and chapter 4, verse 1, it says, Now you, son of man, take a brick, set it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. So here he has to become an artist. He says, I want you to draw the city of Jerusalem on this brick. He says, then I want you to lay siege against it, construct a siege wall, build a ramp, pitch military camps, and place battering rams against it on all sides. This is like what children do when they're playing there. You look at that and you say, that's shameful. It's bringing Ezekiel low, but that's what God's bringing Ezekiel low to teach the children of Israel, that they are also going to be brought low. And so what happens here is that God is God is using these signs to show Israel what is to come. And then in chapter 5, it even says, now you, in verse 1, now you, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as you would a barber's razor and shave your head and beard. Then you will take a set of scales and divide the hair. You were to burn a third of it in the city when the days of siege have ended. You were to take a third and slash it with a sword all around the city. And you were to scatter a third to the wind, for I will draw a sword to chase after them. And so here he's given all of these signs, even to do with his hair. He takes his hair and he cuts it off and he's got to scatter and he has to do all of these signs. And you say, what is going on here? Why is God doing this? And this all seems so hopeless. It opens up with such glory. And now you see shame and the opposite of that. Because that's what the book of Ezekiel does. It starts off with this glorious image of God in His glory. And then you see this fall of where the children of Israel are taken captive and they go through these terrible situations. But yet in the midst of this, God gives a glimmer of hope. God gives a glimmer of hope by telling us and reminding us right in the middle of the book of Ezekiel that in the midst of all of this, where it looks hopeless and where it looks dark, God is still saying, I have a plan for a remnant. I have a plan for my people. And He says that I will take out of them a heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. I will give them a new heart, a heart that will love me, a heart that will follow me. They will no longer have a head that is hard as stone or a heart that is hard as stone, but I will change that, meaning I will take something that looks so desolate and so desperate and filled with destruction and filled with shame and filled with all of this that we see in Ezekiel, that shame and that he's having to go through and the shame that Jerusalem and the children of Israel are going to have to go through. But God is showing us, He's giving us this glimmer of hope to say, but this is not the end of the story. And this is also good news for us, living in our nation and seeing what we are going through, to realize that if God can do this with the children of Israel, and if God can do this and even out of the midst of destruction, and even out of the midst of this chaos, and even out of the midst of this shame, He can bring out a remnant and He can show forth His glory. It gives us encouragement and hope to continue to press on, to know that, number one, God sees everything. When you leave this place tonight, what I want you to leave with is to know, knowing this, God sees. God sees. If you think that He doesn't, go to Ezekiel. Be reminded that God sees, God knows. And when you look at your life and you say, Lord, are things ever going to change? Is it always going to be this way? Is it always going to be shame, destruction, and misery? You can look at the book of Ezekiel and say, even in the midst of darkness, there was always a silver lining. There was always this ray of hope that is shining, to see that even in the most desperate times, God can change things. God can change things. He can change the hearts of His people. And I am longing to get to Sunday night so that I could get to the end of Ezekiel. Because even on Sunday morning, as we go into the middle of Ezekiel, you'll continue to see these terrible things that are happening with the children of Israel. But then also you see that once again that glimmer of hope, and then at the end of the book of Ezekiel, you see how God can use all of that to bring glory to Himself, because He always has a people. And He always has a remnant. And He always has a plan. And evil and darkness will not have the final word. God will. And we are so thankful to know that we serve a God who can turn the darkness into light, and who can turn the hearts of stone into a heart of flesh. So I thank you for your patience in listening to me tonight as we work through the book of Ezekiel. I pray and I hope that you have gleaned something from this. And I pray that the Lord would encourage you through this word to know that He sees you, He knows you, and that He still has a plan, even in the midst of darkness. He is good and He is faithful. So God is good, and all the time. Let's close with a word of prayer. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I would just like to ask everybody to lift my brother Larry up in prayer. He got some bad news from his physician yesterday, and we're praying for, God to help that to be rectified on some lab results. So if we could pray for him, I want to let everybody know that he's going to be coming out to check us out. So hopefully he'll be staying with us, and I'm excited about that. But he does need our prayer.
Okay. What's the name?
Larry Milliken.
Larry.
Yeah, he's also a pastor.
Okay. Certainly will.
Also, Debbie Simmons wanted me to let everybody know that Gerald, our brother-in-law, is back in the hospital and he's been fighting COVID, and he has blood clots now. So, special prayer for him.
You said Gerald?
Gerald Williams.
Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we come before you and we do lift up these requests to you for Gerald, for Larry. Father, you see what they are going through. Lord, as we spoke tonight in your word, you see all things and you know all things. And I pray for them now, Lord, and I pray that you would be with them in a way that only you can. That you would strengthen them and that you would uphold them by your righteous right hand. That your will would be done in their lives and that you would receive glory out of whatever is done, that your name would be praised and exalted. Father, we thank you for this time tonight that we could study your word, and we thank you that your word is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. It's sweeter than honey to our lips. So, Father, we thank you for this time to gather together, to hear your word, to be reminded of your goodness and of your faithfulness, and to know that the work that you start in our lives, you will be faithful to complete it. Father, help us whenever the road gets hard. Father, help us whenever we become discouraged like Ezekiel, and whenever we don't understand or comprehend what you are doing. Help us to know that you always know exactly what you are doing and you have all things under control. So, Father, help us to entrust ourselves into your care. Father, we love you. We thank you for this time together. Father, we thank you for your church. We thank you for this time that we can be edified and built up by your holy word. And I pray that you would take these weak and feeble words that I've spoken this evening and that you would use them to strengthen your people, to strengthen your body, so that we might be faithful servants of you. Help us and forgive us and cleanse us of all of our iniquities and shortcomings and failings, for they are many. Father, help us to see you and to know that you are at work. Lord, we love you, we thank you, we praise you, and we ask all these things in Jesus' name. And the church of God said, Amen. Amen.